Margaret Chen wiped down the steel counters of the corporate cafeteria for the third time that morning. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her apron bore the stains of another busy breakfast rush. At 42, she had been managing the cafeteria at Meridian Defense Technologies for 7 years. Most employees saw her as just another face in the crowd, someone who made sure their coffee was hot and their sandwiches were fresh. What they didn't know was that Margaret had spent 12 years as a covert operative for the CIA before retiring to this quiet life. She had chosen this job specifically because it was ordinary, predictable, and safe. After years of living in shadows and constantly watching her back, serving meals to engineers and accountants felt like paradise. The Meridian building housed one of the country's most advanced defense research facilities. While Margaret served lunch in the cafeteria on the 3rd floor, scientists and engineers worked on classified projects in the levels below. She knew this, of course, but it had nothing to do with her daily routine of ordering supplies, managing staff, and keeping the health inspector happy. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Margaret arrived at 5:30 to begin prep work for breakfast. Her team of 8 employees would arrive by 6, and they would serve nearly 800 people throughout the day. She unlocked the heavy steel doors and switched on the fluorescent lights that hummed to life above rows of empty tables. As she walked through her domain, checking inventory and starting the first batch of coffee, Margaret noticed something odd. The loading dock door, which should have been securely locked, was slightly ajar. She frowned and walked over to investigate. The lock mechanism had been carefully picked, not forced. This was professional work. Margaret's old instincts kicked in immediately. She quietly moved to the security panel and saw that the cameras covering the loading area had been disabled sometime after midnight. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained calm. Years of training had taught her to never show her hand too early. She continued her morning routine, but now every sense was on high alert. When her staff began arriving, she greeted them normally while scanning their faces and body language. Everyone seemed genuine, but Margaret knew that the best operatives were indistinguishable from ordinary people. By 7:30, the cafeteria was busy with the morning rush. Employees lined up for coffee, pastries, and breakfast sandwiches. Margaret worked the register, making small talk and observing. That's when she spotted them. 3 men in maintenance uniforms were sitting at a corner table, barely touching their food. Their uniforms were perfect, but their boots were wrong. The soles were too clean, and the wear patterns didn't match someone who spent their days crawling through air ducts and machinery. More telling, they kept checking their watches and scanning the room with the systematic attention of trained professionals. Margaret's blood ran cold when she recognized one of them. Viktor Petrov. She had last seen him 5 years ago in Prague, where he had tried to kill her during a botched arms deal. He was a specialist in infiltration and elimination, working for the highest bidder. If he was here, this wasn't a simple corporate espionage job. She excused herself and walked calmly to the supply room, where she kept a secure phone hidden behind cases of canned tomatoes. Her hands were steady as she dialed a number she had hoped never to use again. "This is Nightingale," she said when the line connected. "I have a code black situation at my location. Hostile operatives have breached security at Meridian Defense Technologies. Request immediate backup." The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Nightingale, your status was listed as permanently inactive. Are you certain of the threat level?" "I'm looking at Viktor Petrov and 2 unknowns. They've bypassed external security and are positioned for internal access. Whatever they're after is worth risking a daylight operation in a federal facility." "Understood. Backup is 40 minutes out. Can you maintain surveillance?" "Negative. They'll move before then. I'm going to have to handle this myself." Margaret hung up and took a deep breath. She had walked away from this life, but this life had just walked back into her cafeteria. She thought about the hundreds of innocent people in the building, the classified projects below, and the quiet life she had built serving soup and sandwiches. She opened a locked cabinet and retrieved items she had hoped never to need again. A ceramic knife that wouldn't trigger metal detectors, a small device that could override electronic locks, emergency cash, and a fake ID. Old habits died hard, and Margaret had never been one to be unprepared. When she returned to the main dining area, the 3 men were gone. Her heart sank as she realized they had used her brief absence to make their move. She quickly checked the staff access areas and found exactly what she feared. The service elevator that led to the classified levels below was showing recent use. Margaret grabbed her radio and called building security. "This is Margaret in the cafeteria. I need to report a security breach. 3 unauthorized individuals have accessed the lower levels." The response was immediate but not what she expected. "Margaret, this is Director Phillips. We show no security breaches on any of our systems. Are you certain about what you saw?" That's when Margaret realized the scope of the problem. If the building's security systems weren't detecting the intrusion, then these operatives had inside help. Someone with high-level access was assisting them, which meant she couldn't trust anyone in the building's chain of command. She was on her own, just like the old days. The only difference was that now she was wearing an apron instead of tactical gear, and her battlefield was a corporate cafeteria instead of a foreign city. But the skills were still there, buried under years of normalcy but ready when needed. Margaret looked around her peaceful cafeteria one last time, knowing that in the next few hours, everything would change. She had tried to leave her past behind, but sometimes the past doesn't give you that choice. Sometimes it walks into your cafeteria wearing maintenance uniforms and forces you to remember who you used to be. Margaret moved through the cafeteria with practiced calm, her eyes tracking every detail while maintaining her cover as a concerned manager. She approached Jenny, her assistant manager, and spoke in a low, urgent tone. "I need you to implement Code Yellow," Margaret said, using the emergency protocol she had established for food poisoning incidents. "Start moving people out of the dining area gradually. Make it look natural." Jenny nodded without question. She had learned to trust Margaret's judgment over the years, even when she didn't understand the reasoning. Within minutes, Jenny was directing staff to announce that they needed to clean the dining area for a health inspection, politely asking customers to finish their meals elsewhere. As the cafeteria slowly emptied, Margaret made her way to the service elevator. The call button showed the car was stopped on sub-level 3, exactly where the most sensitive research was conducted. She pressed her ear to the shaft and could hear the distant sound of drilling. They were cutting through security barriers. Margaret returned to her office and pulled up the building's service blueprints on her computer. Her security clearance from her cafeteria position gave her access to basic floor plans, but her memory filled in the details that weren't shown. She had studied this building extensively when she first took the job, old habits making her catalog every entrance, exit, and potential hiding spot. The sub-level areas were a maze of laboratories, server rooms, and storage areas. If the operatives had inside help, they would know exactly where to find what they were looking for. But they might not know about the building's unofficial features, the ones that didn't appear on any blueprint. Margaret changed out of her apron and into the spare maintenance uniform she kept in her office. It was a simple disguise, but in a crisis, people saw uniforms before they saw faces. She clipped a radio to her belt and grabbed a toolbox, filling it with items that would serve as weapons if needed. The service stairs were dimly lit and rarely used. Margaret descended quickly, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the concrete steps. At sub-level 1, she paused to listen. The drilling sound was louder now, accompanied by voices speaking in what sounded like Russian. She continued down to sub-level 3, where the corridor branched in 3 directions. The drilling sound was coming from the left branch toward the quantum computing lab. Margaret wasn't surprised. That lab housed prototype technology worth billions on the black market. As she moved closer, she could make out 3 distinct voices. Victor and his team were working methodically, one person drilling while the others kept watch. They had disabled the security cameras in this section, but they couldn't disable Margaret's eyes and ears. She positioned herself at the corridor junction and observed their operation. Victor was directing while a tall man with a distinctive scar operated the drill. The third operative, a woman with short blonde hair, was watching the approaches. All 3 were armed with suppressed pistols. Margaret noted their positions and began to formulate a plan. In her CIA days, she had specialized in asymmetric warfare, turning disadvantages into advantages. Right now, she was outnumbered 3-1, but she knew the building better than they did, and they didn't know she was there. She retreated to a utility room and began her preparations. The building's ventilation system was her highway, the electrical panels were her weapons, and the fire suppression system was her ally. Margaret had learned long ago that the most effective battles were won before the first shot was fired. First, she accessed the building's climate control system and began routing additional power to sub-level 3. The lights would remain normal, but the temperature would start rising gradually. Uncomfortable operatives made mistakes. Next, she used her knowledge of the building's electrical system to create a distraction. By shorting specific circuits, she could create a pattern of power fluctuations that would look like system malfunctions to anyone monitoring from outside. The real preparation, however, was psychological. Margaret activated the building's emergency communication system and began broadcasting a low-frequency tone through the ventilation system. It was barely audible, but studies had shown it could increase anxiety and reduce concentration. Every small advantage mattered. 20 minutes later, she heard Victor's voice echo down the corridor, sharp with irritation. "The temperature is rising. Check the environmental controls. Systems show normal," came the reply from the woman. "Could be a malfunction." "No such thing as coincidences in our line of work," Victor responded. "Finish the job quickly," Margaret smiled grimly. Victor's paranoia was justified, but it was also going to be his downfall. Paranoid people made hasty decisions, and hasty decisions created opportunities. She moved through the ventilation shaft above the corridor, her progress silent despite the confined space. Years of yoga and regular exercise had kept her flexible and strong. She positioned herself directly above their target room and waited. The drilling stopped, followed by the sound of metal hitting the floor. They had breached the quantum lab's security barrier. Margaret heard footsteps as they entered the restricted area, their voices now muffled by distance and walls. This was her moment. Margaret dropped through a ceiling access panel into the corridor, landing silently behind their position. The woman they had left as lookout was facing the wrong direction, watching for threats from the main corridor. Margaret approached from behind, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had done this many times before. Her arm went around the woman's throat in a sleeper hold, cutting off blood flow to the brain. The operative struggled for 15 seconds before going limp. Margaret quickly zip-tied the unconscious woman's hands and feet, then gagged her with medical tape from her toolkit. 1 down, 2 to go. She could hear Victor and the scarred man inside the lab, their voices excited as they located their target. Margaret positioned herself beside the lab entrance and waited. They would have to come out eventually, and when they did, she would be ready. The voices grew closer, and Margaret prepared for the next phase of her improvised battle plan. In her mind, she was no longer Margaret, the cafeteria manager. She was Nightingale, and she had work to do. "Got it," she heard Victor say. 30 years of research in one little device. Our client will be very pleased." "Time to go," the scarred man replied. "This place gives me the creeps." Margaret pressed herself against the wall as 2 sets of footsteps approached the lab entrance. Victor emerged first, a small device in a protective case clutched in his hands. The scarred man was right behind him, weapon drawn and scanning for threats. Neither of them looked in Margaret's direction until it was too late. Margaret struck like lightning. Her ceramic knife found the pressure point on the scarred man's wrist, causing him to drop his weapon with a cry of pain. In the same fluid motion, she swept his legs and sent him crashing into the corridor wall. Victor spun around, his eyes widening in recognition. "Margaret Chen, I should have known." "Hello, Victor. You're trespassing in my cafeteria," Margaret replied calmly, keeping her body positioned between him and his fallen comrade. Victor raised his pistol, but Margaret was already moving. She dove behind a support pillar as his suppressed weapon spat bullets into the concrete where she had been standing. The quantum device skittered across the floor, its protective case cracking against the wall. "You always were too clever for your own good," Victor called out. "But you're outnumbered and outgunned. Walk away and I'll let you live for old time's sake." Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she activated a small device from her toolkit and rolled it across the floor. The smoke grenade she had improvised from cleaning chemicals and electronics began filling the corridor with thick, choking vapor. Through the haze, she heard Victor curse in Russian. The scarred man was groaning and trying to get to his feet, his right hand useless from her nerve strike. Margaret used the confusion to reposition, moving silently through the smoke toward Victor's last known location. A muzzle flash illuminated Victor's position for a split second as he fired blindly into the smoke. Margaret was already there inside his guard, her elbow connecting with his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping, and she followed up with a knee strike to his head. Victor went down hard, his pistol clattering away into the smoke. Margaret quickly secured both men with zip ties and collected their weapons. The smoke was beginning to clear, revealing the aftermath of her swift victory. The quantum device lay near the wall, its case damaged but not destroyed. Margaret carefully picked it up, noting that the internal components appeared intact. Whatever this device was, it had been important enough for Victor to risk a daylight infiltration of a federal facility. She heard footsteps echoing from the main corridor, multiple sets moving quickly in her direction. Margaret tensed, ready for another fight until she heard familiar voices calling her code name. Nightingale. Sound off. Here, Margaret called back, stepping into view as three figures in tactical gear emerged from the stairwell. She recognized the team leader, Agent Sarah Martinez, from her old unit. Took you long enough, Margaret said with a slight smile. I was starting to think you'd gotten lost. Sarah looked around at the unconscious operatives and the damaged corridor. Looks like you had everything under control. 3 tangos down, package secured. Just like the old days. Not quite, Margaret replied, holding up the quantum device. This is what they came for. Some kind of prototype, but I don't know what it does. Agent Martinez examined the device briefly. Quantum encryption processor. This little thing could break any code in existence. In the wrong hands, it would compromise every secure communication system on the planet. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had prevented more than just a theft. This device in the wrong hands could have destabilized global security. There's something else, Margaret continued. They had inside help. Someone disabled the security systems and gave them access codes. This wasn't just an external breach, Sarah nodded grimly. We figured as much. The building's security director, Phillips, disappeared about an hour ago. Left behind his badge, gun, and a resignation letter that was clearly written under duress. Margaret remembered her radio conversation with Phillips earlier. His voice had seemed calm, but now she realized he had been compromised from the beginning. The operatives had forced him to help them, then eliminated him as a loose end. How many more are there? She asked. Unknown. We've secured the building's perimeter, but there could be additional cells. Victor's organization typically works in layers. The team you took down might just be the first wave. As if summoned by her words, the building's fire alarm began blaring. Emergency lights bathed the corridor in pulsing red illumination, and Margaret could hear the distant sound of automatic doors sealing throughout the facility. Lockdown protocol, she explained to the tactical team. Someone triggered the building's security system. Sarah spoke into her radio. Control, this is Martinez. Building is in lockdown. Request immediate status on all exits and personnel. The response crackled through the static. Multiple breaches detected on floors 1 through 5. Unknown number of hostiles moving through civilian areas. Repeat, we have active threats in occupied sections of the building. Margaret's heart sank. While she had been dealing with Victor's team in the basement, other operatives had been moving through the upper floors. The morning shift employees she had tried to protect were now in danger. We need to get up there, Margaret said, already moving toward the stairs. Negative, Sarah replied. You're not active duty anymore. This is our job now. Margaret turned back with fire in her eyes. Those are my people up there. My employees, my customers, people I see every day. I'm not going to hide in the basement while they're in danger. Sarah studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, Nightingale. You're back in the game, but you follow our lead. The team moved quickly up the service stairs, Margaret leading the way since she knew the building's layout better than anyone. As they climbed, the sounds of chaos grew louder. Shouting voices, running footsteps, and occasionally the sharp crack of gunfire. At the ground floor landing, Sarah held up her hand for silence. Through the door, they could hear someone speaking in accented English, clearly giving orders to a group. Secure the main lobby. Anyone who resists is expendable. We need those research files from the 4th floor servers. Margaret counted at least 6 distinct voices responding to the commands. Victor's team had been just the beginning. This was a full-scale operation designed to strip the building of its most valuable secrets. Kitchen staff exit is around the corner, Margaret whispered. If they haven't found it, we can flank them through the prep areas. Sarah nodded and signaled her team to follow Margaret's lead. They moved through the familiar territory of Margaret's domain, past the industrial dishwashers and walk-in coolers that had been her world just hours earlier. As they reached the dining area, Margaret could see through the serving windows into the main lobby. 8 armed operatives had taken control of the space, with at least 30 employees and visitors held as hostages in the center of the room. Among the hostages, Margaret recognized faces from her daily routine. Dr. Williams from the engineering department, who always ordered his coffee with 2 sugars. Sandra from accounting, who came in early every day for a blueberry muffin. Regular people who had walked into what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. Margaret gripped her improvised weapons tighter. These operatives had made a crucial mistake. They had threatened her people, invaded her space, and turned her quiet life upside down. Now she was going to show them why that had been a very bad idea. Margaret studied the scene in the lobby through the serving window, her mind automatically calculating angles, distances, and opportunities. The 8 operatives had positioned themselves poorly, focused on controlling the hostages rather than securing their perimeters. It was a tactical mistake she intended to exploit. The leader is the one by the elevator, she whispered to Sarah. Heavy accent, probably Eastern European. He's got the command presence, but he's also the most nervous. Take him out first and the others will hesitate. Sarah nodded, then spoke quietly into her radio. All units, this is Martinez. We have visual on 8 hostiles in the main lobby with approximately 30 civilians. Preparing to engage. Margaret pointed to different areas of the room. The 2 by the main entrance have the best positions but the worst visibility. The one by the information desk is isolated. Start there. Before Sarah could respond, Margaret was already moving. She slipped through the kitchen's rear exit and into the building's utility corridors. Her years of working in this building had given her knowledge that no tactical manual could provide. She emerged through a maintenance access behind the information desk, her movement silent and swift. The operative stationed there was focused on watching the hostages, his back to Margaret's position. Her improvised garrote made from piano wire and kitchen handles dropped him without a sound. Through her earpiece she heard Sarah's whispered countdown. 3, 2, 1, execute. The lobby erupted in controlled chaos. Sarah's team moved with precision, their suppressed weapons taking down 2 more operatives before the others could react. Margaret was already moving toward her next target, using the panic and confusion to her advantage. The operative by the main entrance spun toward the sound of his falling comrade, giving Margaret the opening she needed. Her ceramic knife found the gap between his body armor plates and he dropped to the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder. Sniper, someone shouted in Russian. Multiple contacts. The remaining operatives began firing wildly, their discipline breaking under the unexpected assault. This was exactly what Margaret had hoped for. Panicked fighters made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. She dove behind the reception desk as bullets chewed through the marble surface above her head. The hostages were screaming and trying to take cover, but they were trapped in the center of the room with nowhere to go. Margaret caught sight of Dr. Williams crawling toward the elevators, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. Sandra was huddled behind an overturned chair, tears streaming down her face. These people were her responsibility, and she wasn't going to let them become casualties of someone else's war. Sarah, I need a distraction, Margaret spoke into her radio. 30 seconds, then I'm moving to extract the civilians. Copy that. Smoke out in 5, 4, 3. The lobby filled with thick gray smoke as Sarah's team deployed their remaining grenades. Margaret used the cover to sprint toward the hostages, grabbing Dr. Williams under the arms and dragging him toward the relative safety of the elevator alcove. Stay low and follow me, she called out to the others. Move toward the elevators now. The hostages began crawling and running in her direction, some helping wounded colleagues. Margaret provided covering fire with one of the captured weapons, forcing the remaining operatives to take defensive positions. Through the smoke, she saw one of the operatives raising his rifle toward the fleeing civilians. Margaret's shot took him in the chest before he could fire, and he tumbled backward over a decorative planter. This is control to all units, came a voice over the building's intercom system. Federal agents have secured the lower levels. Surrender now and you will be treated according to international law. Instead of surrendering, the remaining operatives became more desperate. Margaret heard one of them shouting orders in what sounded like Arabic, followed by responses in Russian and German. This wasn't just one organization. Multiple groups were working together, which explained the scope and coordination of the attack. Margaret counted muzzle flashes through the smoke. 4 operatives left, including the leader by the elevators. Sarah's team had them pinned down, but they were using the reception desk and lobby furniture as cover, creating a dangerous stalemate. Margaret, we need to end this quickly, Sarah's voice came through the radio. Building sensors show possible explosive devices on the upper floors. If this drags out, they might bring the whole place down. Margaret's blood ran cold. Explosives meant this was more than just a theft operation. If they couldn't steal the research, they were prepared to destroy it rather than let it remain in American hands. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Unknown. Could be minutes or hours, but we can't take the risk." Margaret looked at the terrified faces of the hostages huddled around her. These people trusted her to protect them, just as they had trusted her to serve their morning coffee. She had taken this job to escape from violence and danger. But violence and danger had found her anyway. "I'm going to try something," she told Sarah. "Give me 60 seconds, then be ready to move on my signal." Margaret reached into her toolkit and pulled out her last improvised device. It was dangerous and unpredictable, but desperate times called for desperate measures. She had learned its construction during a mission in Afghanistan, where American forces had been pinned down by insurgents in a similar situation. The device was simple. Compressed air from the building's pneumatic system, combined with kitchen cleaning chemicals and metal fragments from the damaged lobby furniture. When it detonated, it would create a flashbang effect that would disorient anyone within 30 feet. Margaret positioned herself near the edge of the smoke cloud, then hurled her improvised weapon toward the center of the lobby. "Flash out," she called into her radio. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Even through her closed eyes and covered ears, Margaret felt the disorienting effects of the blast. For the operatives who hadn't been expecting it, the effect would be devastating. She moved immediately while the enemy was still blinded and deafened. The operative by the elevator was stumbling blindly, his rifle forgotten as he clutched his ringing ears. Margaret's knee strike dropped him to the marble floor. Through the clearing smoke, she could see Sarah's team moving in to secure the remaining targets. 2 operatives were down, unconscious from the blast effects. The 4th was trying to crawl toward an exit, his movements unsteady and confused. Margaret reached him first. He looked up at her with unfocused eyes, clearly concussed from the explosion. In accented English, he gasped, You're supposed to be just a cafeteria manager." "That's right," Margaret replied, zip-tying his hands behind his back. "And you just messed with my cafeteria." Sarah approached, surveying the aftermath of the lobby fight. "Nice work, Nightingale. But we're not done yet. Building sensors show movement on floors 2 through 6. The explosive devices could be anywhere." Margaret stood up, brushing debris from her improvised uniform. Around them, her colleagues and customers were beginning to emerge from their hiding places, shaken but alive. She had kept them safe, but the job wasn't finished yet. "How many more?" she asked. "Unknown. Could be a dozen, could be 50. This operation is bigger than we initially thought." Margaret looked up at the ceiling, knowing that somewhere above them, more operatives were moving through her building, threatening more innocent people and carrying enough explosives to bring down the entire structure. "Then we'd better get moving," she said, checking her remaining weapons and supplies. "I've got 6 floors of my building to take back." Margaret and Sarah's team moved through the building methodically, clearing each floor with practiced efficiency. The 2nd floor housed administrative offices, and they found evidence that operatives had been there. Computers torn open, filing cabinets ransacked. But no enemies remained. The 3rd floor was where Margaret's cafeteria was located. Seeing her workspace turned into a battlefield was surreal. Tables were overturned, her carefully organized prep area was destroyed, and bullet holes scarred the walls where she had served thousands of meals. "They use this as a staging area," Sarah observed, pointing to equipment cases and ammunition scattered across the dining tables, probably regrouped here after the initial infiltration. Margaret knelt beside her industrial coffee machine, which had been shattered by gunfire. She felt an unexpected pang of loss. That machine had been part of her daily routine for 7 years. Now it was just twisted metal and broken dreams of normalcy. 4th floor, she said, standing up. "That's where the main servers are located. If they're after research data, that's their primary target." As they approached the 4th floor stairwell, the sound of drilling reached their ears. Just like in the basement, the operatives were cutting through security barriers to access protected systems. Margaret held up her hand, listening carefully. 3 voices, maybe 4. One of them sounds like he's directing the others in Arabic. Sarah nodded and positioned her team. Same playbook as before. "You know this building better than anyone. What's our best approach?" Margaret closed her eyes and pictured the 4th floor layout. Server room is in the center of the floor, surrounded by administrative offices. Only 2 ways in, Main corridor or emergency access through the HVAC system? We take both, Sarah decided. You and Johnson go through the vents. Martinez and I will take the main approach. Margaret found herself crawling through another ventilation shaft, this time with Agent Johnson behind her. The confined space felt familiar now, like returning to an old skill she had never really forgotten. Through the vent grates, she could see into the server room. 4 operatives were working with military precision. One was downloading data from multiple terminals while another was placing what looked like explosive charges on the main server arrays. They're not just stealing, Margaret whispered into her radio. They're preparing to destroy everything they can't take. Copy that. How long do we have? Margaret studied the charges being placed. Those are demolition packs with timer detonators. If they follow standard protocol, they'll set them for 15 minutes after they finish the download. Can you disarm them? Maybe, but I need to get close, and they're not going to give me a clear shot. Through her earpiece, she heard Sarah's voice. Movement in the main corridor. We're engaging now. The sound of gunfire erupted from the hallway outside the server room. The operatives inside immediately took defensive positions, their data theft operation forgotten in favor of survival. Margaret used the distraction to drop through the ceiling access panel directly above the explosive charges. She landed silently behind a row of servers, her presence unnoticed by the operatives who were focused on the firefight in the corridor. The timer devices were sophisticated, military-grade equipment that would require careful handling. Margaret began working on the first one, her fingers steady despite the chaos around her. Years of diffusing improvised explosive devices in hostile territory had given her the skills she needed. One of the operatives spotted her. He shouted a warning in Arabic and swung his rifle in her direction. Margaret rolled behind a server rack as bullets sparked off metal casings around her. Contact in the server room, she called into her radio. I'm pinned down but working on the explosives. Agent Johnson dropped through the ceiling behind her, his suppressed weapon already firing. The operative who had spotted Margaret went down, but his comrades were now aware of the threat from above. Margaret continued working on the demolition charges while Johnson provided covering fire. The first device was disarmed, but there were 5 more scattered throughout the room. Each one was connected to enough explosives to bring down this entire section of the building. Margaret, we've got a problem. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio. More tangos coming up the emergency stairs. At least 6 heavily armed. How long can you hold them? Not long. They've got RPGs. Margaret's hands moved faster on the second explosive device. The timer showed 8 minutes remaining, but if those reinforcements reached this floor, it wouldn't matter. They'd all be dead before the explosives even detonated. She heard the distinctive whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade, followed by an explosion that shook the entire building. Ceiling tiles rained down around her as she worked on the third device. Sarah, report. We're falling back. Corridor is compromised. They're advancing on your position. Margaret finished disarming the third device and moved to the fourth. Her hands were steady, but sweat was running down her face. Through the server room's reinforced windows, she could see muzzle flashes in the corridor outside. Agent Johnson was wounded, a bullet having grazed his shoulder, but he continued returning fire. How many more? He asked through gritted teeth. 2 left, Margaret replied, working frantically on the penultimate device. But this one's different, more sophisticated. The timer showed 5 minutes, but the wiring was unlike anything she had seen before. Multiple redundant triggers, anti-tampering devices, and what appeared to be a motion sensor that would detonate the charge if moved incorrectly. I can't disarm this one, she admitted. It's designed to prevent exactly what I'm trying to do. Then we evacuate, Johnson said. Get everyone out of the building. No time. The blast radius would include the surrounding blocks. Hundreds of casualties. Margaret stared at the device, her mind racing through possibilities. Then she remembered something from her CIA training. Sometimes you couldn't prevent an explosion. Sometimes you had to redirect it. Johnson, I need you to help me move these servers. We're going to create a blast channel. Are you crazy? Moving anything will trigger the sensors. Not if we move everything at once. The sensor is calibrated for individual movement, not structural changes to the entire room. Working together, they began repositioning the heavy server units to create a funnel that would direct the explosion's force toward the exterior wall, instead of into the building's core. It was dangerous work under fire, but it was their only chance. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, Margaret could hear orders being shouted in multiple languages as the remaining operatives coordinated their final assault. She had 3 minutes left on the timer and one more device to address. The final explosive was positioned near the room's main power supply. If it detonated there, it would cascade through the building's electrical system and potentially trigger fires on every floor. Margaret reached for it just as the server room door exploded inward. 3 operatives rushed through the smoke and debris, their weapons already firing. Johnson went down hard, his return fire going wide as he hit the floor. Margaret dove behind the improvised blast barrier they had created, bullets chasing her across the room. 60 seconds, she called out, more to herself than anyone else. The final device was just 10 feet away, but those 10 feet might as well have been 10 miles with hostile guns trained on the area. Margaret pulled the last item from her toolkit, a small mirror she used for checking around corners. She angled it to see the operatives' positions, then made her decision. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall mount and pulled the pin. The chemical foam began spraying everywhere, creating a thick cloud that obscured vision throughout the room. Using the cover, she sprinted toward the final explosive device. Bullets whined through the foam around her, but the operatives were shooting blind. Margaret reached the device with 30 seconds on the timer. Her hands shook as she worked to disable the anti-tampering mechanisms. 20 seconds. The wiring was incredibly complex, designed by someone who knew exactly how to prevent what she was attempting. 15 seconds. Through the dissipating foam, she could see one of the operatives moving in her direction, his weapon raised. 10 seconds. Margaret made a desperate choice. Instead of trying to disarm the device, she grabbed it and hurled it toward the exterior wall, where their improvised blast channel would direct the explosion away from the building's structure. 5 seconds. The operative saw what she was doing and fired, his bullet catching her in the shoulder and spinning her around. 3 seconds. Margaret hit the floor behind the server barrier as the device struck the exterior wall. 2 seconds. She pressed herself against the floor and covered her head. 1 second. The explosion was deafening. The exterior wall of the server room simply vanished, blown outward into the parking lot 4 floors below. The blast barrier Margaret and Johnson had created held, directing most of the force away from the building's core structure. Margaret's ears were ringing, and her shoulder was on fire with pain, but she was alive. The building was still standing. Through the gaping hole where the wall had been, she could see daylight and hear the distant sound of sirens. "All units, this is Control," came a voice through her damaged radio. "Building is secure. Repeat, building is secure. All hostile contacts have been neutralized." Margaret struggled to her feet, checking on Johnson. He was unconscious but breathing, his pulse steady despite his wounds. Around them, the server room was destroyed, but the critical data appeared to be intact on the protected systems. Sarah's voice came through clearly now. "Nightingale, report your status." "Alive," Margaret replied, though her voice was hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Explosives neutralized. Building is safe. Outstanding work. Medical teams are en route to your position." Margaret walked carefully to the blown-out wall and looked down at the parking lot below. Debris was scattered across the asphalt, but no civilian vehicles had been in the blast area. Her redirection of the explosion had worked. In the distance, she could see federal agents loading captured operatives into armored vehicles. The threat was over, but Margaret knew her quiet life as a cafeteria manager was over too. She had saved the building, protected innocent lives, and prevented sensitive research from falling into hostile hands. But in doing so, she had revealed skills and knowledge that would make her a target for every enemy organization that learned of her involvement. As medical personnel arrived to treat her wounds, Margaret realized that sometimes the past doesn't just catch up with you. Sometimes it completely reshapes your future, whether you want it to or not. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in her rebuilt cafeteria, watching contractors install new equipment where her old coffee machine used to be. Her left arm was still in a sling from the bullet wound, but the doctor said she would make a full recovery. The building had been repaired with remarkable speed, though the 4th floor still showed signs of the explosion. The exterior wall had been rebuilt with reinforced materials, and additional security measures had been installed throughout the facility. "Margaret?" Dr. Williams approached her table, carrying a cup of coffee from the temporary service station. His forehead still bore a small scar from the lobby incident, but he seemed to have recovered well from the trauma. "How are you feeling, Dr. Williams?" she asked, gesturing for him to sit down. "Better, thanks to you. I wanted to thank you again for what you did. All of us in the building that day owe you our lives." Margaret nodded uncomfortably. She had never been good at accepting gratitude, especially when the thanks came from people who didn't know the full story. The official report listed her as Security Consultant Margaret Chen and made no mention of her CIA background. "Just doing my job," she replied. Dr. Williams smiled. "Serving coffee and stopping international terrorists? That's quite a job description." After he left, Margaret returned to checking inventory lists, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to her routine. But everything had changed. The employees looked at her differently now, some with awe, others with barely concealed fear. Word had gotten around that their mild-mannered cafeteria manager had single-handedly taken down a team of professional operatives. Sarah Martinez appeared at her table, dressed in civilian clothes but still carrying herself with military bearing. "How's retirement treating you?" she asked with a slight smile. "About as well as you'd expect," Margaret replied. "Have a seat." "Coffee? Please." The stuff at headquarters tastes like motor oil. Margaret poured 2 cups from her personal thermos, noting that Sarah was scanning the room out of habit. Old instincts died hard. "The debriefing is complete," Sarah said quietly. "Victor and his surviving team members are in federal custody. The investigation revealed that they were working for a consortium of foreign intelligence services, all interested in the quantum encryption technology." "How many total?" Margaret asked. 33 operatives from 6 different organizations. Your actions prevented what could have been the largest intelligence theft in modern history. The quantum device they were after would have compromised every secure communication system used by NATO forces. Margaret sipped her coffee, considering the magnitude of what had almost happened. "And the inside man?" Director Phillips was found alive in a warehouse across town. They had been holding his family hostage to ensure his cooperation. "He's been cleared of any wrongdoing and offered trauma counseling." "That's good. He seemed like a decent man." Sarah leaned forward. "Margaret, I have to ask, have you given any thought to coming back? The agency could use someone with your skills and experience." Margaret looked around her cafeteria, at the familiar tables and chairs, the serving line where she had spent 7 peaceful years. "I thought about it, but this is my life now. These people, this place. I can't just walk away from it again. Even after what happened, your cover is blown. Every hostile intelligence service on the planet knows who you are now. Then I'll deal with it when the time comes. But I'm not running anymore." Sarah nodded, though Margaret could see the concern in her eyes. "The agency will provide security monitoring, just in case. And if you ever change your mind, I know where to find you." After Sarah left, Margaret walked through her domain, checking on the restoration work. The new equipment was state-of-the-art, funded by a grateful government that couldn't publicly acknowledge what she had done, but could ensure her workplace was better than before. Jenny, her assistant manager, approached with a clipboard full of vendor invoices. "The new security cameras are being installed tomorrow. Seems like overkill for a cafeteria, but I guess after what happened, better safe than sorry," Margaret agreed. As the day wound down and the last of the evening shift employees finished their meals, Margaret found herself alone in the quiet cafeteria. She turned off the lights and locked the doors, following the same routine she had performed thousands of times before. But as she walked to her car in the parking lot, she noticed details that would have escaped her notice 3 weeks ago. The way shadows fell between the vehicles, the blind spots where someone could hide, the escape routes available if she needed to run. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Well played, Margaret. Until next time. An admirer." Margaret deleted the message without replying, but she made a mental note to vary her route home and check her mirrors more carefully. The quiet life she had built was gone, but she was still here, still standing, still serving coffee to people who trusted her to keep them safe. As she drove through the streets of the city she had called home for 7 years, Margaret realized that perhaps she had been fooling herself about leaving her past behind. Maybe the best she could do was find a way to live with it, to use her skills to protect the innocent people who had become her extended family. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the small house that represented everything she had tried to build outside the world of shadows and violence. Tomorrow, she would return to her cafeteria, serve coffee and sandwiches, and maintain the illusion of normalcy. But she would also be ready for whatever came next. ready to protect the people who depended on her, ready to be both Margaret the cafeteria manager and Nightingale the operative, because sometimes the world demanded both. Margaret Chen walked into her house, double-locked the door behind her, and began planning for a future that would never be quite as simple as serving the perfect cup of coffee, but it would be hers and she would face it on her own terms. The cafeteria manager had saved 33 lives and prevented an international catastrophe. More importantly, she had learned that sometimes you can't escape your past, but you can choose how to use it to build a better future. In her kitchen, Margaret began preparing tomorrow's menu, knowing that her customers would be counting on her to provide more than just food. They would be counting on her to keep them safe, one meal at a time.